right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm here with my good friend Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
Very well. I'm very much looking forward to speaking to an old friend and one of our former guests today.
That's right. So we have the return of the ever so gracious Christoph at Halalcoholism. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult word. Okay. How have you been doing, Christoph?
Yeah, not too bad. We've been I'm stuck in lockdown here in Melbourne at the moment, but hopefully we're going to be out of that soon. I don't know. It's we're just kind of going through the motions and trying to find ways to entertain myself at home. So that's not ideal, but it is what it is.
It's great that you've only ever been on one other podcast, those Raziv's podcast, and then ours, and then this is the second time you're coming on ours. So it seems like we're about to get the legal rights to your voice because aside from this, you don't really like do anything, right? You don't have a podcast or anything like that.
Yeah, well, I get a lot of requests from all kinds of Joe Rogan and all that stuff, but I said no, Joe. I only do it for my boys, Vince and Bruce.
That's great. Very much appreciated. I'm
Yeah,
glad that everything is going well for you guys. I know it's a bit, it's been becoming an issue over there in Australia more so now. And so I hope everything continues to go well for you and your family and nothing ever, you don't have to worry about anything.
yeah.
But yeah, but again, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. A huge fan of your Twitter. Everyone, you got to go follow him. One of the first people that I even followed on Twitter when I was sort of getting into I suppose, intelligentsia, for a lack of a better term, that scene. And it's been, the great thing about your Twitter is, if I can advertise it for you for a few seconds, is that
Please.
one, yeah, it's poignant. You have poignant points, right? You certainly have a voice, you have your opinions, but you also add a very good mixture of wit to it. I would say that your Twitter, from an ideological perspective, is very closely resembling Sarah Hyder, which I know you're a big fan of, as we are here. And
Mm,
so I think that's how I'm trying to remember how I came across your Twitter in the first place. It must have been something relating to Islam, I think. Does that sound right? Were you at one point
could have
talking
been.
about that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I've had a bit to say over the years. Probably not as much these days, but I guess you go back a few years and there was all kinds of stuff to talk about in that respect.
Hmm.
And I guess it was something that there's there's a lot that gets said about it in the media and so on, but not enough. It's kind of, there's a bit of a partisan divide about it. Like, I think a lot of right wing people were quite happy to talk about Islam, and liberal types are less happy to talk about that they to touch it with kid gloves kind of thing. And I sort of think it's the world's second biggest religion, and it's not. I don't think it's really punching down to talk about to Islam in a critical way, or any religion really. I think I'm being a sort of left wing leaning person. I think we have structures that oppress people of different kinds, whether it's economic or social or ideological, and I think we need to talk about those. So I've talked a bit about religion and Islam, partly because that's part of my sort of cultural background that I
Hmm.
grew up around, and it's obviously been a poignant issue over the last couple of decades.
Hmm.
Islam is how I myself entered the what we now know, or what we've formerly known, so to speak, as the intellectual dark web, the IDW, which I think has gone to shit over the last year after after COVID, after the Trump election, and it just seems to have completely splintered. I mean, the last time we spoke, there was this loose confederation pretty much was still there, but now it just seems like it's fallen apart completely. I mean, but I just think it's really unfortunate because it really gave us a space, an avenue, some kind of area from which we could go in and talk about complex ideas between a really polarized news networks. There was like Fox News Republicans on the right wing, and there was MSNBC for the left wing. But in between, there was this large morass of ideas and nuances that were never explored. Now the IDW is gone. So I guess my question is right now, what comes next?
That's a
Yeah.
good question, man. I don't know. I mean, I was never a fan of the IDW as a concept, intellectual dark web. It's just the name of it. It sounds incredibly cringe to me. But I did, I did like a number of people that were involved with that. So yeah, I think one of the problems with it is like you get when you get people who they're famous because of kind of being contrarian, right? So they're expressing a view that's not maybe not discussed in the mainstream circles or something like that. But then those kind of people are also, it's kind of like you don't know when to stop being contrarian, right? So you can be contrarian about certain things that need to be said and aren't being said. And then the contrarian is, it's almost like a drug. I mean, this is what I think happened to Majid Nawaz in a way, in that he just, that contrarianism took over, and he just thought he had to have a much cleverer view than everyone else on everything, and go against what the sort of liberal mainstream was saying. And I think that the problem is that, there are certain things that you really need to go against the sort of elite liberal mainstream consensus, right? But then other things, it's just kind of common sense. Like, vaccines is one thing. Like, so to me, I'm not really interested in engaging any of the sort of anti-vax sort of stuff that's going on out there. Whereas obviously some of the IDW guys have gone, if not fully anti-vaxxer, like at least soft anti-vax kind of stuff. And that's one of those things. Yes, being pro-vaccine is a mainstream sort of opinion and is backed by the experts and that sort of stuff. And it's almost like these guys had to show themselves to be the cleverest ones in the room by taking a outsider position on that.
Yeah, the IDW started off, I think when it first started off, I looked at the list of people who were in that piece, I think written by Barry Weiss, and I liked most of them. I like Joe Rogan. I don't think he's this intellectual giant or anything like that, but he has he's inquisitive. I like Sam Harris. I liked Brett Weinstein at the time. I didn't like Dave Rubin. Just the list of people, generally speaking, I liked them. And the idea was that, well, this is a coalition of people talking about things that no one wants to talk about, and they all differ politically. Sure, they differ politically, probably economically mostly, but they're not really talking about that. They're just talking about the same thing. They're talking about sort of woke culture, and and I'm concerned about that as well. But there was always this bad taste in my mouth when all you do is you're just getting a collection of people who agree on this one topic, and then you're branding it, even especially in something as cringy as the intellectual dark web, as you said. That's a terrible branding. But it's interesting to see what's been happening. Sam Harris pretty much gave up his IDW card in one of his podcasts when he was talking about Trump. Brett Weinstein took this sort of, route. Oh, I'm gonna have to block out those words because YouTube will nuke this episode. But he went down that route. Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein to me was always the strangest one. Strangest mostly because he came across as what would be a good word to put it? I want to say pseudo intellectual. Mainly because there was this podcast called discussing whether or not he's a crackpot, because the thing with him, the thing that I was just sort of weirded out by, was that he clearly thought that his genius was going unnoticed, and he still thinks that. So when he was on his brother's podcast, Brett Weinstein, he said he was really angry. He said you deserved that Nobel Prize and it was stolen from you. He has his own theory of everything about geometric unity. It's just really, he just comes across strange and suspicious. So I don't really listen to him that much. But the downfall of the IDW, I think, really was brought about by two things. It was Trump, which everyone lost their minds over, and then it was this pandemic. which, you know, Majid Nawaz, Brett Weinstein, they went a different route. Sam Harris was really the only one who was, you know, pretty hardcore pro-vaccine. And if you want to dump in, you know, Claire from Quillette as part of the IDW as well, then you know, she's on Sam's side. So it's just strange to see this, because I thought to myself, wasn't the whole point of this group that you guys differ on opinions, but you guys can still talk to each other? And now you guys are just dumping on each other on Twitter. Aren't you just defeating the whole purpose of the conception of this group? So, you know, when Bruce asks, like, what comes next, like, nothing. Don't form these groups just based off of one thing that you agree on. There's no point. All you have to say is, like, yeah, look, we disagree on some things, we can talk about it, and that really is just as far as one needs to go. There's no reason to construct these groups.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, yeah, you mentioned the Trump thing and the pandemic. Like, I think any time that you've got a group that labels itself as intellectual, and then half of them end up supporting Trump, or at least doing a sort of soft Trump apologia kind of thing, then that's a real red flag, right? Like, the intellectuals who kind of like Trump or think Trump is only, you know, isn't that bad, that's a problem. And part of it is that, you know, primarily, you know, whatever you say the objective of the IDW seemed to be primarily about critiquing the excesses of the left, which is fine. Like, you know, I think that's important. But then, you know who else critiques the excesses of the left? The right wing. We've got a right wing that does that. And when you start to have that as your main focus, and that's the thing you talk about all the time, what stops you from either, you know, just sliding into the right wing or becoming indistinguishable, in effect, from the right wing? Because there's a lot of other stuff that people can talk about, and particularly when, you know, you've got sort of right wing and far right wing governments in ascendancy. You know, like we had 4 years of Trump in the US, and that's clearly stuff that, like, I think when that's going on, and all you're focusing on is, you know, the left did this, the left did that, effectively, you know, it's becoming closer and closer to just being part of the right wing ecosystem. You know, like if we look at Dave Rubin as an example, I think the thing that was interesting about Dave Rubin early on, let's say 2014, 15, wherever he sort of started in this space, yeah, he was someone who was kind of on the left and he was critiquing the left. Good. And then gradually he wasn't left anymore. He was like, oh, I'm a liberal, but I'm a classical liberal, and I'm kind of a libertarian. And eventually he just straight up became a conservative. And there's nothing interesting about a conservative who critiques the left. You know, there's if you're on the left, and it's quite obvious that you're on the left and you're critiquing the left, that to me is an interesting perspective. Just as right wingers who critique bad stuff on the right, that's quite interesting. So Rubin, in a way, is a kind of barometer of the IDW. He kind of, even though he's not an intellectual by any means, you know, he's kind of this, in a way, a linchpin that held all of it together. And he was one of the first ones to just like start sliding towards the right. And it's not just being a right-wing intellectual, you know, because there are there's lots of intelligent people giving you right-wing perspectives on things, whether you agree or not. There's people that you can appreciate the thought that goes behind it. Rubin just became this guy who would parrot the dumbest right-wing talking points, and you know, he was just retweeting Donald Trump Jr. and promoting people like Candace Owens, who's just a moron, basically. And you know, it's that friendliness to just the dumber ideas of the right wing that is, you know, to me that's kind of been the undoing, because someone like Sam Harris, who, you know, I've had a lot of kind of disagreements with Harris recently, but I think, you know, he's still trying to be intellectually honest and to take a nuanced view of this stuff, and he's stayed pretty true to what he's about. watching everyone else kind of slide into just accepting anti-vax ideas and pro-Trump ideas, it's just, it's very difficult to brand yourself as a sort of group of intellectual free thinkers when your free thought always tends to gravitate towards, what Tucker Carlson agrees with,
I think I already know the answer to this. We probably just answered the question, but like, I was gonna ask, did the IDW fail? And to really flesh that out is to really flesh that question out. I'll say that I thought the whole point of the intellectual dark web was to have some kind of space where we could, like I said before, where we could explore the complexities between Fox News and MSNBC. To give some kind of center for, a lack of a better term, and but one of the things that caught me off guard was that I didn't see us splintering. Excuse me, I didn't see it splintering us into even more tribes when it shattered in 2020. I mean, we were talking about Brett Weinstein's crowd, and now we see the pro-vaccine crowd, and I see a lot of parallels between the woke and the anti-woke. With the vaccine versus the pro-ivermectin crowd, I see people strawmanning each other, taking what someone said completely out of context and using that to smear the reputations online. The same spiel, and I was like, holy moly, this is exactly what we see between the criticisms of the woke left and these smaller sub-tribes we see forming within the former IDW crowd, I might add. So, that it just really depresses me, because I wonder if we've really learned anything for the need to be intellectually rigorous and honest. So, I really have to ask, and I really like to ask your perspective on this, especially since we're in 2021 now. We're still in the middle of this pandemic. Is there really a space for quote unquote heterodox thinking? And the IDW was a great idea, but I think the three of us agree that it was a failure. So, is there still a space for that?
Yeah, I mean, surely there must be, right. Just to follow on from what you were saying about the way that woke and anti-woke have kind of mirrored each other. Like, when you've got a sort of woke left that thinks everything is a symptom of white supremacy, that should be easy enough to critique. But then the anti-woke side, I mean, a lot of those people have gone into this way of thinking where everything is communism, so everything is cultural Marxism, everything is communism. So Joe Biden is a communist or is doing communist stuff. Kamala Harris said something about equality and equity, which is kind of like it's a sort of a standard social justice talking point that no one really thinks about, but people saying, well, this is evidence that she's actually they're trying to put through communism into into power in the American to rule the American populace, that kind of stuff. It's just the same kind of catastrophic thinking that has really caused some problems in the progressive movement, and then it's just being mirrored from a different perspective on the anti-woke left. I think there needs to be space for heterodox thinking, and I think that they're still going to be there. Maybe they just won't have the same forum, the same hype as a sort of group that the IDW had. But some people have kept their heads. Some people who are sort of adjacent to that IDW space, they're still doing their thing. I mean, I think if you guys have listened to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter discussing stuff, I think that, and that's a particular set of views they have about race and that sort of stuff. But I think what's good about them is that even if you don't agree with their perspectives, they try and do justice to what they're critiquing. So there's a lot of people who critique, wokeness and that sort of stuff, who basically just straw man what the quote unquote woke people would think. Whereas they, I think Glenn and John seem to really try and understand what is the perspective of the people that they might disagree with, rather than just having this kind of one-sided anti-woke perspective. I think also, you've got people like, Sarah Hayter that you mentioned, Jesse Single and Katie Herzog are, another examples that they've got a really good podcast, and they're certainly in certain circles of the progressive movement, they're very despised figures. But if you actually listen to their perspectives, I think there's a lot to take from that, and I think they're people who will not just try and straw man the people they disagree with. They'll try and, they're both journalists, so they actually do try and get an accurate perspective, and which means they'll actually walk back stuff if they realize they've made a mistake in a previous episode. They'll cover their bases, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Who else am I thinking about? There's even if we go further left, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ben Burgess. He's a sort of socialist Marxist guy who writes for Jacobin, but he's also had a lot to say about cancel culture. And he, together with the late Michael Brooks, who, Michael Brooks is someone I've had a lot of disagreements with, but he was, before he passed away a year or so ago, he was talking a lot about how cancel culture is a threat to left solidarity and stuff like that. So there are people on, even in the sort of Marxist socialist movement who are coming up with critiques of some of the stuff that's going on the left. And I think one flaw of the IDW is it never sought to go into those left spaces. I think too many people dismissed the left wing as this kind of monoculture of just woke people, whereas the left is a diverse group of people who all hate each other for various reasons. So Sam Harris would have various people who were kind of center-right, neocons and that kind of stuff, and he would happily have a chat with someone like David Frum, who a lot of people on the left regard as a monster for his speech writing for the cheerleading on the war in Iraq and so on. And he would have a chat with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, and these people who are on the right wing. But someone like Ezra Klein was that kind of almost too far left for him, and that was a very difficult conversation. And yes, there are problems with having conversation with some people on the left, because I think some people have that tendency to want to throw accusations of racism and things like that around, but there's a lot of people who aren't, and I think there's a lot of people who are quite interesting thinkers on the left that you can explore these issues with, but the IDW never seem to want to kind of go there. Another example, just as a sort of left-wing type thinker I'm talking about, I don't know if he's as well known to you guys, but Adolph Reed is another guy who's a black Marxist professor. I forget which university he's at, but he's one of these very class first kind of guys, and he's been very critical of identity politics. He actually got disinvited from a DSA speaking gig once because they thought his views weren't sufficiently progressive or something like that. But he's obviously very much on the left, and as a sort of black intellectual, it's he has views that don't align with the majority of the sort of woke progressive side on that. So there are people like that. And it's just about seeking those people out to have the conversations, rather than just in a sort of center to center right sort of sphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a bunch of great ones. I love John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, and as you said in those podcasts, Glenn Lowry always tries to say, well, 1 second, John, let's see what they would say, and he does a pretty good steelman of the opposition. I think the best way to describe what's going on, there's a moral panic on both sides of the other. When I attended this libertarian convention a few months ago in July, And I'm not a libertarian, but I was invited by a few friends. I said, yeah, you know what, I'll go. John McWhorter was speaking there, so I said, oh, I'll go meet John McWhorter. And I met him, and he was the nicest person I've ever met in my life. But it was this libertarian convention, and I would have conversations with people out there, and the main threat that these people understood was Marxism and communism. They constantly said these two words over and over and over again. As you said, they accused Joe Biden of Marxism. They would accuse public intellectuals of Marxism. That was the main thing that they were concerned about, even in places where it didn't quite seem to fit. It sounded like, well, is it possible to just believe in in a particular version of socialized healthcare? Is there a chance of even believing that maybe a capitalist system should have a good amount of socialization? You'd ask those questions, and they would say, no, that's communism. That's redistributionism. And so it was this panic that they had, and then you see this a similar panic on the left, where you're just scared of the typical accusations of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, where everything is so identity based, and if you attempt at a nuanced look at an identity based issue, well, you must be therefore against that identity. And so it's just this moral panic everywhere, and to some extent I get why there's a moral panic on the right, because in their perspective, all these institutions are being captured by what they consider to be wokeness. And so, that's why I try to be understanding when I hear someone promoting something or being a vaccine hesitant, because I get it. Yeah, a lot of these institutions have been shown to be all they want is your money. They're not actually really interested in being honest. A lot of these woke corporations are just doing wokeness because it fits their bottom line. A lot of these academic institutions are consistently silencing conservatives. There was a report by Eric Kaufman that showed that over 90% of professors do self-censor. So I get it. This is a genuine problem that shows that their voices are being drowned out, and they're being drowned out forcefully. So I understand it. But at the same time, you really need to be careful with what it is that you're saying, what it is that you're promoting, and what it is that you're doing. Because in this particular instance, the vaccine instance, it's not just a personal, sort of my body, my choice sort of thing. What you're doing is going to affect other people. So I really hope that you're doing your homework. But a lot of people don't. And so I kind of want to ask you this. I asked this guy earlier the other day, because Mick West, he's a debunker, right? So he'll see a bunch of UFO videos and that people think are UFOs, like the Pentagon UFO videos that everyone went crazy over, like Joe Rogan, and he sort of debunks them, but his debunking is very technical. So you have to know some level of trigonometry to look at some of these videos and know at what altitude the plane is at, right? I asked him something along this lines. It's like, well, how do you convince the general population who isn't going to understand this stuff, right? So when it comes to vaccines, you can't read an article and understand sufficiently enough about how the vaccination process works. You won't be able to read a couple of articles and understand in depth how epidemiology works. It's not possible. You need to go to med school for that sort of stuff. And so what a lot of these lay people, they'll listen to Brett Weinstein, or they'll read a few articles from wherever it is. They'll just hear convincing arguments like, okay, there's these institutions that have lied to us, and they've consistently lied to us, whether that means because we know this because of leaked memos, or we know this because of whistleblowers, or we know this because they'll tell us straight to our face. They're lying about that. They've been lying to us this whole time. What makes us expect that they're going to be telling us the truth about this pandemic? And most people really will stop there. They'll think that's convincing. You can't expect people to look at these peer-reviewed articles and understand what's going on, because it's just too complex. And so people like Nicholas Christakis, like Sam Harris, they have their work cut out for them, because they have to convince a giant population of people, their listeners, that they should get vaccinated, that this pandemic is a legitimate issue. But the reasoning behind why people should do this is because, well, the experts said so. I mean, they themselves can't understand in detail what exactly is going on. It really just boils down to, well, our biggest experts are saying it. But then the other people are saying, but they've lied about this other stuff, so why would you trust them? And so that's difficult for me. I have no idea how we're going to convince these group of people against it, because, I mean, it's complex. Have you thought about this? what the best way to sort of navigate this area would be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have an answer, but like as to what you said about the experts having lied, I think again people can't separate that out into, is it politicians or is it the actual experts? Like
Mm-hmm.
the if we're looking at doctors and scientists, so like 95% of doctors have been vaccinated, as far as I know, like something like
Yeah.
that, and doctors as a group are overwhelmingly in support of getting people vaccinated, and there's a difference between what they think and then the politicians and the medical people in official positions who have to kind of communicate this stuff to the public, and they've got other considerations to think about, and they also get things wrong, and people don't necessarily distinguish between, yeah, they got something wrong, so they're probably wrong about everything else, as opposed to, their advice might overwhelmingly be correct, but there's certain aspects in which they have got things wrong, or they've gone too far in one direction, or not far enough in another direction. I think a big part of this is that people, all of us, we have this tendency to think in a binary way, and not and I guess it looks like, coming back to the IDW topic, ideally the idea of that was to kind of find that sort of middle ground between the extremes and be able to talk about those issues. But it's similarly, like, people only think about things in terms of teams, a binary, it's black or white, left or right. And because they have dissatisfaction with one set of people, which, the amorphous idea of the sort of the elite, the experts, that kind of stuff, then they end up going to believe what the other side says, and the other side is the anti-vaxxers, the contrarian, kind of far right friendly kind of groups. I mean, I think someone like James Lindsay or whatever, who was so unhappy about what the sort of progressive side was doing, he just decided to embrace basically every position of the right wing, including being anti-vax and being pro-Trump and that sort of stuff. And there's people like that. It's just like, well, I'm not happy with the establishment. I'm going to go against the establishment, and they're telling me something that appeals to me in a different way. So I think a lot about, what's our incentives for thinking a particular way. So it works in different ways. So if you buy what the government is telling you, there's a certain comfort in that, because you don't have to think too much. Well, this is what the experts seem to say, I'm going to follow that, and I feel safe, and and for the most part that will work out okay. But then the other perspective of questioning the government and questioning vaccines and everything like that, there's a psychological appeal to that too. So it's kind of like, well, the experts tell you this, but I know something better. I'm smarter than the sheep. I don't follow the crowd. So that is also psychologically rewarding to people. And so telling them, hey, there's actually something that the experts don't want you to know, and I'm going to give it to you, and this is, this will make you smarter than everyone else. In effect, that is very seductive to a lot of people. So being able to get beyond that sort of polarized binary way of looking at stuff, you either swallow every single thing the government tells you, or you swallow everything that the anti-vax crowd tells you. It is difficult to get people to evaluate things on their merits, particularly when it's scientific. But getting people to think, okay, so let's what are doctors recommending? What are scientists recommending? Not necessarily what is your government telling you. What is the? I mean, I personally don't have the high level of scientific knowledge to understand everything about vaccines and viruses and that sort of stuff. But I happen to be married to a doctor, and my father is a retired doctor, and I've got a big social circle full of doctors.
Mhm. Oh
and
yeah. What are you, Ben
they
Shapiro, bragging about your wife?
sprung. That's actually me. But yeah, like I think I I have to kind of go with what the experts around me are telling me. Like it's not just about what food do I like better? Is it pasta or curry? That's a personal choice. But when you've got the overwhelmingly number of experts who on a matter who say a particular thing, you have to at least, if not take that as a whole, you have to at least weigh that very strongly. And the people who are in the minority, there's a chance they might be right. I might be wrong about everything that I've believed about viruses and pandemic and vaccines, but the weight of the evidence doesn't say that. It's important to be able to be open-minded without being so open-minded that your brains fall out, as someone once said.
That's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. It's one of the ideas that gets really thrown out there now. So we're talking about tribes, is the idea that this lack of intellectualism, this choosing whoever it is we want to believe, more or less, has to do with the decline of Christianity, the decline of religion in the West. I've honestly never bought that argument. It just seems to me that humans are they're just machines conditioned for believing, and we just like religion, whether it's Christianity or Islam, which is how we met you, how we got introduced to the IDW, is that we just tend to fall into whatever tribes that happen to be adjacent to whatever kind of social environment we happen to be in, and whatever ideological influences we happen to be close to. We tend to fall into those and tend to get dragged into one thought bubble or another. Do you think this is the case? I mean, I'm still a very much a proponent that since Christianity's declined, there isn't necessarily a God or Christian shaped hole that we need to plug it with. That's never made sense to me. I just think that the most logical answer is that we've not evolved to think more or less like a computer. Have you ever thought about that, especially with your background and regarding Islam, so much to speak?
Yeah, I think the appeal of religion, I think there is a sort of religion-shaped hole that's emerging, and what religion gives people is a sense of certainty. There's a comfort in believing a bunch of stuff that is set out in front of you. People really don't like the heterodox thinkers. I mean, if someone has let's just say someone is left-wing and they have a view on one thing that kind of aligns with what right-wing people think, or at least sounds like what right-wing people think, people will then assume that this person has right-wing views on everything else, because we're so conditioned to viewing people in these tribes. So it's like if you criticize Islam, well, you're probably a racist, because I know racist people like to say mean things about Muslims, so you're probably one of those. Or if you critique identity politics, well, yeah, you're probably a racist, because racist people also say things that sound vaguely like a critique of identity politics. So being part of that tribe just gives it that sense of certainty. If I can believe what my tribe thinks, I don't really have to do the mental wrestling with opposing points of view. Like we love to be able to just repeat slogans. So believe the science, or trans women are women, or there's lots of different examples of these things, which might be like quite complicated questions that we should wrestle with. But if someone just gives you a slogan and says, "This is what my tribe believes," just repeat that and believe that. And even if it doesn't stand up to further questioning, you just stick to what you've been told by the people in your bubble, or by your pastor or your imam or whatever the case may be, or the politician, and then that's just comfortable. You don't need to have that uncomfortable position of stepping out and expressing an idea that's different to your tribe. Like you've probably all seen. If you haven't seen this, you should really check it out. It's this clip that went viral from the Libertarian convention one year of people. So Gary Johnson said something about I think people should need a driver's license. At least show some kind of indication that you can drive before you before you drive around. And people were booing him. And another guy said, "Well, what's next? A toaster license to toast a piece of bread." And that kind of shows that it's this bubble. In that case, it's libertarians, and they've all got because they're in a bubble, the views become a bit more extreme. Whereas someone saying something that's very normal, which the vast majority of people would agree with, like you should have a driver's license before you can drive a car, he gets roundly booed because that's seen as different to that tribe. Mm-hmm. So there's just this comfort in just believing what your group believes, and you step outside that, and people will start to say, "Oh, well, that's a bit problematic." You might be a Nazi for thinking that, or you might be a communist for thinking that, or whatever it is. So that's part of what keeps us in our bubbles, that social pressure.
Do you think that's related to, we're talking about taking comfort in a thought bubble or a tribe, but do you think that's related in any way to what is called the meaning crisis going around? I'm trying to study a little bit more on sociology, like what's ailing the Black community, what problems do men face with respect to women that's not being talked about, and like one of the things that I've been looking into is is the deterioration of our social structures, like the nuclear family or the lack of a father. And we see that according to Thomas Sowell's research and some sociological data that we have, that the lack of a father in the Black community has really destabilized it from the 1960s onwards. You see, I think some commentators I listened to said that, like, I think this even happened to Majid Nawaz, like without a stable, well, maybe it's not fair to include Majid in this, but like some youths are recruited into organizations like ISIS or some gangs because of a lack of a father. And what does the father provide? A steady guiding hand, a meaning, a purpose. And without those social structures, there comes with it a loss of direction and meaning, and that seems to be contributing to to a kind of feeling that you need to reach out and grab onto something. Would you agree with this, or is there something?
Yeah, definitely. And I think even for some of the people who have joined ISIS or similar extremist groups, they get inducted into that. They're missing something in their life, and the ideology that group center provides a sort of a certainty to them. And even you get some of the people who committed terrorist acts over the last few years who were not part of an extremist group as such, so they were kind of acting on their own, inspired by ISIS or whatever. And a lot of those people were people who were involved in petty crime, or that they were not very strongly religious. But then at a certain point, it's kind of like they decided, to get, my life is sort of, adrift at the moment. I've just haven't been following a steady path, and the certainty of a particular kind of extremist way of thinking and those actions and the promise of redeeming myself through getting to heaven, that's very appealing, as opposed to being in this sort of, being lost in life where I'm making all these wrong decisions, and I need someone to guide me. I've just been floundering on my own. I think obviously ISIS is a world away from just being woke or whatever, but the set of ideas and beliefs that what we might term woke ideology, that provides that meaning to people, that just being able to hold on to certain beliefs and a sort of guiding principle of we're going to make the world a nicer place by saying certain things and believing certain things and that kind of thing. That is something that I think really appeals to people.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about um, how you feel about mainly doing this discourse on Twitter, because it's pretty much that's your avenue, right? That you don't have a podcast on YouTube or anything like that. You mainly do Twitter, and I've always found Twitter to be, without a doubt, one of the most toxic places to talk about anything about. I mean, it's so insane. You'll see people are so entrenched in their own ideological bubble that you're almost never going to talk to anybody who disagrees with you. I mean, you can look at a Candace Owens tweet that has like 100,000 likes, that's arguing for this sort of pull yourselves up by the bootstraps mentality for the black community, and then you'll look over at a Logan Paul. I just found this out recently. I guess Logan Paul's like super woke. Apparently, Logan Paul will like put out a video clip from his podcast defending people like Ibram Kendi, saying it's not enough to be not racist, you have to be actively anti-racist. And that tweet has 500,000 likes. It's overwhelmingly positively received. And so I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, these people clearly aren't talking to each other, and like neither of these people are ratioed. You're gonna find a lot of ratioed people, but you're also gonna find a lot of people like Candace Owens, like Logan Paul, like Ben Shapiro, whose tweets are largely positively received because the only people looking at them are people who already agree with them. And so I've always been concerned with Twitter that's like, well, to some extent you're just sort of preaching to the choir. It's not really this sort of maybe it is meant to be, and technically it is sort of this public square where everyone can access your information, but no one's going to want to access information that they don't want to take a gander at. And when they do take a gander at it, it's it's toxic. People are really, really toxic on there. I mean, so that's why I want to ask you, do you or how has your experience been on Twitter, sort of trying to have these hot takes, as you have on your Twitter bio, out there? Has it been generally a positive experience, or what are your thoughts generally on Twitter as like a platform to even sort of introduce politics, introduce culture, and these important topical conversations?
I mean, I like to think that I've over the years I've managed to cultivate a followership that is kind of open to heterodox ideas. I mean, I think people who followed me for a while know that I'm generally left or liberal, but I'll say things that don't necessarily go that fit into that tribe. But there's a lot of people, like for example, the person who is generally left-leaning or liberal but thinks political correctness has gone too far. That person, there's a lot of those people out there, right? Or who is open to being critical of religions, for example. The problem with Twitter is it's an economy of dunking, right? So to dunk on someone from the other team or from a group that you don't like, that's how you get engagement. Like, you could sketch out a particular perspective, really nicely, and you might get a few likes on that. But if you can do a savage dunk on someone who your group hates, you'll get lots of retweets. People love that because it's like a gladiatorial combat or whatever. It's a sport that people want to watch the opponents get defeated. And also part of it's like some people do like to engage in these, actually in-depth conversations on there, but I find it really tiresome. It's hard to do all the time because if someone asks you, disagrees with you and wants to discuss something you've said, you can reply, and it could actually be a good conversation. But a lot of time, it's going to go back and forward. The conversation is going to go on lots of different twists and turns. And 3 days later, you're still addressing this one question that someone asked because it's become about something else. And, you might mention something, you're trying to talk about one point that a person has raised, and you mention, something else, and they start talking about that point, and you're trying to get to sleep. It's 11:30 at night or whatever, and you're getting this reply from someone saying, well, that's bullshit because, and then I've just got to respond to this, and then suddenly it's 12:30 and you can't sleep because you're all kind of steamed up, and your mind is too alive.
Yeah.
And so as a forum to have those discussions, it can be really, some people manage it, and there are actually some really good interactions that you can see, but mostly it's a way of, at least for me, it's a way of kind of just making fun of dumb things that I see, and I just don't have the stomach to have these long, nuanced conversations anymore, because I've got other priorities in life, you know what I mean? And there's a lot of times when I've, in good faith, tried to address a complaint that someone has had about something that I've said or whatever, and the majority of times, by responding in good faith, it doesn't help you. You end up just getting called something else, labeled as something, because people aren't that interested in understanding other people. People want to know, okay, I'm right, and I'm going to engage with you as a way to show that I'm right, prove to myself and prove to you that I'm right, and prove to my other audience that I'm right. And not many people are really that interested in saying, okay, I want to maybe learn something. Okay. There's a guy I know on Twitter, I won't mention him, but he constantly just posts things that are straw man of what so-called anti-woke people think. So it's basically him just taking this vague idea of what a conservative position is on something, and says, this is what anti-woke people think. And then obviously lots of people say, well, actually, being anti-woke, there's right-wing, there's left-wing, there's centrist people who believe this. He's not interested in learning, because he doesn't listen to the people that actually give him different information. He's sort of signaling to his crowd, this is what I want to believe, and this is the thing that makes us feel good about what we believe. And it makes us feel good to believe that this group that disagrees with us are this kind of bigoted or backward-looking bunch of people. So, I think one of the big truths we have to reckon with is that people don't want to learn new things. They want to just be affirmed in what they already believe. The default of human learning is not to look at all the facts and then come to a conclusion. It's to make a conclusion early and then selectively look at all the facts to bolster your own point of view. Yeah. And that's how most people operate.
What concerns me so much about Twitter is that Twitter really does have a mind of its own. And what I constantly say to people is that Twitter is not representative of the general public. What is popular on Twitter is not what's popular amongst your coworkers, your blue collar workers. It's not the same. But what happens is that if you go on the trending tab, it's mostly people agreeing with each other about a particular issue. Like most recently, it was the guy from Jeopardy. He got fired because I guess he had a podcast back in 2008 or 2009, and he said some edgy jokes, I think, that were at the expense of his female co-host. So in the context of that podcast, like, he was joking with her and she was laughing back, so she didn't say that, she didn't have a problem with it. But he was like jokingly calling her like a slut or something like that, whatever. It's edgy humor. And so people were celebrating. Largely speaking, people on Twitter were celebrating, oh, good, that, he said those sexist jokes. Now he doesn't get to host Jeopardy. And so what I often have to remind people is that, look, most people on Twitter are not politically engaged. They're just there, they follow their friends, and they'll see these things on the trending tab. So what happens is that these people will see what's trending, and they'll see like, oh, most people are agreeing that this was a good thing that he was fired, so they kind of like recalibrate their brains, like, okay, so that's where we are at in society. We have to go with that now. But the issue with that, like, I'll see that and I go, wait, okay, so he made edgy jokes with his friend. Uh, every person that I've encountered, whether that means people that I've worked with or people that I went to school with, have always made edgy jokes. Like 95% of the population in the privacy of their homes make those edgy jokes. Not
Not
you,
me.
or not me. You can't. Yeah.
I only say nice things.
And I'm thinking to myself, wait, so if the vast majority of the population clearly is okay with that type of humor, at least they're okay with that humor with people who like consent, right? So your friend who you know is going to be okay with it, you'll say edgy humor with. This person that you just met a few minutes ago, you're not going to immediately start saying edgy jokes. Like, you just met that person. You don't know if they're okay with it. But largely speaking, like, everybody behind closed doors says inappropriate jokes. I don't understand what, you know, and again, I'm saying this coming from someone, I'm not really I barely say any jokes at all. I don't even say jokes. I'm like a pretty serious guy. So, you know, this is coming from someone who I don't have a vested interest in wanting to publicly say edgy jokes, because I just don't really, in real life, I'm a pretty serious guy. But I don't understand the moral issue here. It's between two consenting people who are okay with with that sort of humor. I would assume that the audience they've cultivated have also been okay with that humor, because they've been, I don't know how long they've had that podcast for, but if they've had that podcast for some time and they've been joking about that for a while, well then okay, their audience knows what kind of humor they have and they have the choice to either leave or share. So I'm like, why are we policing jokes? If it's between consenting people who are okay with that, who know that they're jokes, why does it matter what they said in the past? I don't understand why we're making a huge moral panic out of this, and I think it just goes to show you the power that Twitter has. Twitter has that power where that the 2% can influence what everybody else is going to do, and that is hugely concerning. I mean, this person got fired because enough people on Twitter complained. He got fired for something that most people do in the privacy of their own homes. And so I was talking to Bruce about this. It's almost like this version of Twitter, this sort of, you know, for a lack of a better term, this far left, you know, woke version of Twitter. They're resembling the right very similarly, where they're trying to police what people do in the privacy of their own homes. It's like, well, if you're okay with edgy humor, you should not have a platform. It doesn't matter if, you know, your fan base is okay with it. If the people that you are privately talking to are okay with it, it doesn't matter. You're not supposed to say that stuff in the first place. And I don't understand, like that's what the right always says about, it's like, oh well, if you make fun of religion, you should be, you know, you're not allowed this platform. Your job should get away. It's like it's the same thing. Because I've read the contemporary literature on humor. There's nothing, you know, there's no conclusive you know, study that shows that if you make edgy humor, then you're going to make society edgier, and you're going to perpetuate like sexism. Like, there's no study on that. Like, that there's no we'd have no good reason to believe that, because that's what a lot of people, they say, like, well, if you make jokes about this, you're normalizing that culture. We don't know that, and if anything, the evidence says otherwise. So I'm thinking, like, are we really, is Twitter really going down that route where it's almost indistinguishable to some extent to the right? And so that's why I don't really want to go on Twitter anymore.
Yeah, it is. It is that kind of environment, and I think part of it is, you know, what you said was really true in that we you know, when I was growing up, it was conservatives who were the moral police, and would be complaining and trying to police people's private behavior. They still do that, but the left, you know, these progressive spaces have really joined in on that moral policing in a different way. And I think if you look at, so, you know, thinking about us, you know, in terms of tribes that we, you know, our ideological tribes. So if you're on the right, you know, you're sort of primed to be looking out for things that are degenerate or extreme from the progressive wing, right? And then so you see something that, you know, once you really get into this mindset, you start looking for those kind of things. Let me see if I can find something that's communist, that looks a bit like communism, and I can tell all my friends about it and warn people about it. And on the left, people are primed to look for racism and sexism and homophobia and things like that. And in the past, there's been a lot more of those things to look for. Obviously, I'm not saying that racism is over, or it does, come up and down a bit, but overall, there is a lot less racism than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But if you're progressive minded, you've still got that in you, that part of what makes you a progressive person is that you're against racism and sexism and other kinds of discrimination. And so you want to find those things. And if someone says, look, here's an example of racism, that's something you can highlight. And part of it is to show that I'm against this. I'm criticizing this to show everyone that, well, I don't stand for that. I'm against racism or whatever it is. But also, it's a way of affirming to oneself that, I'm fighting the good fight here. I'm on the right side by opposing this thing. And sometimes, the things that we're looking for to fight, they're getting increasingly minor and minor and smaller, but we amplify them because we want something to fight against. Ideally, I can't remember if I said this to you guys last time, but ideally, if there's someone who's accused of saying something racist, and if another person is able to show, actually, in context, that's not racist at all, that this is what he actually meant, and so you see that's not actually a problem. If you don't want there to be racism in the world, you should actually be to welcome that, someone pointing out to you that it's not racist, because you think, oh, okay, good. It's good to know that person is actually not racist, and what was said is just a misunderstanding. I've never really seen people go, oh, okay, good. I'm glad to know it's not racist. They want to hold on to the idea that what that person said is racist, because it just bolsters their worldview of, oh, there's racist things that we need to fight against. People like to think that there's all this bad stuff out there that needs to be fought against. It's like, imagine we want to be Batman, but if Batman lived in Tokyo as opposed to Gotham, Tokyo, where there's very little crime, what's he going to do? He's going to start, looking for, whatever little crime he can find, some, minor transgressions, because he doesn't have major crimes to fight against. So it's like, I think moral policing is like actual policing in that sense of, if police aren't out, they don't have major crimes to solve, they're going to look around and say, okay, who can I bust for something relatively minor? I'm going to bust this guy for jaywalking. This guy, he's he said something, he swore in public. I'm going to get him for it. And people who that they want to have the energy of the civil rights movement and fighting racism and that sort of stuff, but the racism as it is, it's got less and less and less. So we're looking for, someone said the N-word when they were, they're rapping along to a song. Well, that's racism. I'm going to punish them. And, that's me fighting crime, a moral crime, and showing to everyone that I don't stand for that I'm against that.
Yeah. Well, Christoph, I want to thank you endlessly for coming on.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. I really love speaking with you, hearing your perspective. It's always great. And we hope to see you again in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to finally sign that contract on the rights to your voice now that we've been the podcast with the most. But yeah, thank you so much, Christoph.
Talk to my lawyers and we'll sort it out.
Okay. We'll go ahead and have a conversation with them. But it was great. Thank you so much. We'll hope to see you again in the future.
My pleasure, guys.